All right, diving into our third game, we have Magnus Carlsen versus Veselin Topalov from a 2019 Blitz tournament. In the game, 1e4 best by test, then c5, and then we head straight for the Sveshnikov variation of the Sicilian defense. We've seen this before in games 1 and 2, and again here the key move e5, breaking in the center, forcing knight b5 from white, then d6 from black. Now, in the last two games, we saw white go knight to d5. That is the new, sharper variation that Fabiano Caruana made extremely popular following the 2018 World Championship match. However, instead in this game, Veselin Topalov goes for the older move, bishop g5, putting pressure on that knight on the f6 square. Now, this move makes a lot of sense. Obviously, white wants to go knight to d5 at some point, so it makes a lot of sense to pin that knight on the f6 square. That knight, of course, is guarding d5. If it falls, then white's going to have uncontested control of that d5 square. Now here Magnus goes for the main line, starting with a6, knocking back the knight. Obviously here the only good move is knight to a3. Now here white is threatening knight c4. If white gets that in, he can go knight to e3, and from there both those knights will guard the d5 square. So obviously black doesn't want to allow that. With that in mind, he typically goes b5 here. Now, knight c4 is not possible, and white's knight on the e3 square is looking a little bit silly. Now, here, white has two main ideas in this position. One is knight d5, jumping into the d5 square immediately. The other is bishop takes f6, trying to get black double pawns on the f-file after g takes f6. Now, both of these moves are playable. In the last two games of this series, we are going to see knight to d5. That is the main line nowadays. However, first, we have to cover two games in the line with bishop takes f6. This leads to very, very sharp positions. You simply have to know what you're doing as black here to survive. Now, first of all here, Magnus Carlsen is forced to play g takes f6. The alternative, queen takes f6, is a massive blunder. Here, white simply wins on the spot with knight d5, threatening knight to c7, forcing queen d8 from black. And then here, the key move for white is bishop takes b5. The idea is after a takes, then knight takes b5. Once again, you're threatening knight c7 on the next move. There's very little black can do to stop this idea. So all that to say, here in this position, after bishop takes f6, black is forced to go g takes f6. Now, these double pawns can be a weakness or an asset. It just depends on how the game goes. Obviously, they do weaken his king side a little bit. But on the other hand, black can go f5 in this position, getting rid of those double pawns. And from there, the bishop cleans up on f5. And from there, black can start pushing his remaining f-pawn and his e-pawn down the board, trying to get an attack going against the white king. So overall, after g takes f6, we have some wild attacking positions ahead of us. Here, white jumps into the d5 square with the knight, knight d5, the standard idea. Obviously, beyond that, it also puts pressure on f6, and it also frees up that c-pawn to move into the game. For example, white may want to go c3, and then to maneuver knight c2 to e3, bringing the knight on a3 back into the game. So overall, it's very important for white to go knight d5 immediately here. Now, in this position, black has two main lines he can choose from. There's the older move f5. Then after, the idea is after e takes f5, bishop takes f5, black is doing perfectly fine. Instead, Magnus Carlsen is a big fan of the alternative, bishop g7. Now, this move is a little bit more controversial. It doesn't fight for the center of the board as quickly as f5. However, it's also a very playable idea, and Magnus Carlsen has used it with a lot of success in his games. Now here, this is a big tabia for white. He has a ton of different ideas that he can use to put pressure on black. Real fast, I do want to give you an overview of some of them. Here, one of the main ideas for white is bishop d3. This move clamps down on the f5 square, stopping an immediate f5 from black. That would obviously lose a pawn after e takes f5. Here, black is forced to go knight to e7 in order to challenge that knight on the d5 square right away, and it leads to very double-edged positions. Beyond bishop d3, one of the most dangerous ideas for white in this position is actually queen to h5. The idea, once again, being white is clamping down on that f5 break from black, and again, black has to go knight to e7, challenging that knight, and gaining control of the f5 square. Instead of these two options, here Veselin Topalov goes for perhaps the main line. That is simply c3. Now, we've already touched on this move. The idea, of course, is to go knight to c2, then knight to e3, and from there, that knight on the d5 square will be supported by the other knight, and white's minor pieces are all going to be excellently placed. Now here, black goes f5. Obviously, if white did go bishop d3 or something like that, then f5 wouldn't be possible. But here, f5 is a playable move, and Magnus is basically transposing back to the original f5 line, where you go f5 before bishop g7. So both of these lines can transpose back to each other. Now, obviously, white takes on f5. Black, of course, was threatening the move f takes e4 here, so you can't allow that. E takes f5, then bishop takes on the board. Now, Veselin Topalov continues his plan. Knight to c2, intending knight to e3 next, hitting the bishop with tempo, and from there, white can simply continue developing. Now, here, Magnus castles his king. Short castles on the board. Veselin Topalov goes knight c to e3, again, continuing that plan. And here, of course, you don't want to go something like queen d7 supporting the bishop. Obviously, those bishops are very, very powerful in this position. That's one of Black's main strengths in this line with bishop takes f6, then g takes f6. Again, although his pawn structure is damaged a little bit, those bishops do help a lot in terms of him getting compensation for it. So here, the bishop has to retreat. The question is just which square. Now here, Magnus retreats to the best square, bishop e6. This square is better than g6, as on g6, the bishop doesn't control the middle of the board as much, and it's also exposed to an idea h4 to h5 from white. For example, if black went bishop g6 here, then the key move for white is the immediate h4, and this move is very difficult to stop. Obviously, h5 is possible, but that would further weaken the king side for black, and if you don't do it, then h5 is coming next for white. Now, heading back to the game, bishop e6 on the board by Magnus. Now, Veselin Topalov has to get his king side developed. How does he do that? Well, in the game, he goes bishop d3, by far the best square for the bishop. Alternatively, there are some lines where you do go bishop e2, or even g3 and bishop g2, but in this kind of position, d3 definitely the best square for the bishop. Now here, Magnus, obviously, he has to get his attack going on the king side. We saw in games 1 and 2 how black can do that with the idea of f5. Here, Magnus goes f5, gaining space on the king side. Now white castles. And in this position, Magnus Carlsen has the option of going f4 or e4, gaining more space on the king side. Should he do either of those, or should he hold off for now? If you're going to play the Sveshnikov in your own games, that is very important to understand the differences between these ideas. Here, f4 is actually a very big mistake. The key move for white is going to be queen to h5, putting pressure on that pawn on h7, and it's very difficult for black to defend. So f4 here, not a good idea, simply because it leaves that bishop on d3 way too active on this diagonal. Now, instead of f4, a waiting move like king to h8 is also possible. Black getting his king off the exposed g file off this diagonal, and that could be helpful later in the game. Instead, here, Magnus expands in the center with the move e4. Now, this is a very thematic idea in the Sveshnikov Sicilian. Obviously, black gaining space and opening up the e5 square for the knight to jump into the center of the board. However, of course, there are some drawbacks to this move. The main drawback of the move e4 is it gives up control of that f4 square, and that means after e4, black can jump in with the knight to f4, putting pressure on that bishop on the e6 square, and that is exactly what Veselin Topalov does here. Now, again, as we discussed, that bishop on the e6 square has to stay alive for black here. Bishop f7 is played. Then Veselin Topalov, bishop c2, getting the bishop out of the attack. And bishop c2 is a better move than bishop e2 here, simply because from c2, the bishop has access to this diagonal. And if black's bishop ever moves from the f7 square, that bishop on b3 could be very, very powerful. Now here, how should Magnus Carlsen continue the attack? Obviously, with this weakened pawn structure and those bishops, black simply needs to get something going on the king side. And now his pawns on the f5 and e4 squares are blocked by white's knights. So with that in mind, Magnus needs to find a new way to get the initiative. Now here, the best move is going to be queen to g5. This move hits the knight on the f4 square. It also lines up the queen with the king. And overall, this is the best way to try and force through f4, f3 ideas. Instead of that here, Magnus Carlsen plays a different idea, bishop e5, immediately putting pressure on the knight on the f4 square. However, it's not really clear if the bishop is better placed here. Obviously, with the bishop on the e5 square, knight to e5 ideas are not going to be possible for black. Now from here, white jumps in with the knight to the d5 square, knight d5, by far the best idea. And once again, that move queen g5 is the right play for Magnus Carlsen. Instead, he doesn't find the move or doesn't want to play it, whatever it is. Instead, he goes king to h8. Now, king to h8, again, is a very thematic idea in the Sveshnikov, getting the king off that open g-file, off this potential diagonal here. However, it was a little bit slow in this position. Now here, Veselin Topalov has to do something about Magnus Carlsen's threat of f4, queen g4, and so on, getting the attack going on the king side. What should he be doing? Well, he has a couple of different ideas. First of all, that pawn on the f5 square is hanging. Knight takes f5 is certainly possible. Of course, here black's going to have the resource bishop takes d5, opening up the attack on the knight with the rook. And then after queen takes, rook takes, black wins back the pawn. Now that knight on c6 is hanging. Queen takes c6 is possible. But then black can go d5. And again, the attack continues. He may have rook a7 to g7 ideas. The queen could swing over to the g5 square, and so on. So knight takes f5 was one possibility for Veselin Topalov. However, overall, Magnus would still be doing okay. Instead, he goes for a more defensive idea, and quite frankly, and one I like more, although the computer doesn't seem to agree 100%, I still like this move, f4. The idea is you block black's pawn on the f5 square. If black goes e takes f3, you can always gain back with the queen or the rook. You're just trying to gain a little bit of breathing room on the king side, and you're trying to slow down black's attack a little bit. Now here, Magnus takes on the f3 square. E takes f3 is the move. Queen takes f3, takes back. Then we have a trade on the d5 square. Bishop takes, knight takes, and finally Magnus shows his idea. Queen to h4, bringing the queen over to the king side. And obviously here, the threat is either queen takes h2 or bishop takes. That would be an absolute disaster if white allows it. Now, during this whole sequence, obviously, Magnus did give up his light square bishop on the f7 square, taking on d5. And one of the drawbacks of that is this light squared bishop on c2 is now completely unopposed. And again, white may have the idea of going bishop c2, lining up the bishop on this diagonal. Or at any point, if that pawn on the f5 square falls, again, white could have dangerous threats on this diagonal, lining up with that pawn on the h7 square. So, overall, very double-edged idea by Magnus, giving up that light squared bishop. Let's see how it plays out. Here, obviously, Veselin has to do something about that threat on the h2 pawn. In the game, he goes g3, blocking the attack. The queen is forced to go back sooner or later, but instead of the immediate retreat, here Magnus makes use of that king h8 move, and he goes rook to g8. Now, here, of course, that pawn on g3 is pinned. G takes h4 is not possible, as then the king would be in check by the rook, so not a legal move. So instead here, Veselin Topalov, knight to f4, retreating the knight back to the king side, and overall trying to reduce some of that pressure on that g3 square. Of course, back here, there were various bishop takes g3 threats available. For example, if white waits to move a3, then bishop takes, h takes, and rook takes would win the queen. So obviously can't allow that. Instead, knight to f4 on the board, a good defensive move. And here Magnus decides it is time to preemptively get out of the attack of that g-pawn. He retreats the queen back to h6, a very solid idea. Again, this is blitz. You don't want to give your opponent too many chances to go g takes h4 in the future. So with that in mind, queen h6 on the board. And here Veselin starts to go astray. In this position, he takes on f5 with the bishop. Now, this move looks logical. Obviously, you're winning a free pawn. That pawn on the f5 square was vulnerable. However, the problem with this move is black can simply follow up with the idea of rook a to f8, and suddenly his rooks on the f8 square and g8 square are going to be slicing down the board. Pair that with the queen, and you can see white's king is going to be in trouble. Instead of that, the key idea, as we talked about earlier in this game, is going to be bishop b3, reactivating the bishop on a different diagonal, pressuring that rook on the g8 square. And from here, it's not really clear how black should continue the attack. Now, instead, bishop takes f5 on the board. Magnus obviously responds rook a to f8, lining up the rooks and the queen with the white king. And here, white has to find a very precise defensive move to really stay in the game. That move is going to be knight to g2. Now, this move looks kind of crazy. If you go knight g2, obviously, you are opening up that queen to a pin by the rook on the f8 square. Obviously, now the bishop can't move, and black has various threats. However, temporarily, there aren't any winning ideas for black, so knight g2 overall would have been the move. Now, instead, in the game, Veselin Topalov jumps forward with the knight to e6. This move looks a lot more aggressive. However, the problem is without that knight on the g2 square, there are all sorts of sacrificial ideas on g3. And here, Magnus Carlsen just goes for it. He plays the move bishop takes g3. And this turns out to be a brilliant move that basically wins the game on the spot. Here, Veselin takes on g3. It's effectively the only move. And then Magnus shows his idea. Rook takes f5. It's a deflection, actually. The queen has to stay here defending that pawn on the g3 square, and if it moves, then rook takes g3 is going to be absolutely devastating. On the other hand, though, if white doesn't take that rook on f5, then black's attack is just exploding all the same, and white's going to be done for. So in the game, white takes the rook on the f5 square, queen takes f5, sorry. But then Magnus Carlsen, rook takes g3, and in this position, Veselin Topalov resigned on the spot. And here's why. It's checkmate in literally one more move. The king has to go to the f2 square. Obviously, all of the other squares on the g file and the h file were covered by the queen and the rook. So king f2, and then here Magnus has a very simple checkmate. Queen to e3 check, and the king has nowhere to go. All of these squares being covered by the queen and the rook, and of course, white's rook on the f1 square blocking f1 from the king. So with that in mind, in this position, Veselin Topalov resigned. A very impressive attacking game by Magnus Carlsen.